When building a custom car, it is important to have your craftsmanship shine through your build. You put a lot of time into your project and you want it to stand out, right? Not only the way that presents itself immediately, but also when people get up close and look at it, look behind panels, you want it to be a solid ride, right? So today we're gonna cover how to have a warp-free weld. Now I know that sounds impossible to many of you, but today I'm gonna show you my method to make large seams in custom sheet metal completely disappear. So what we're going to be doing is on the other side of the car, we've already made a custom quarter panel. We're going to be fitting the wheels to the car and then eventually making it look like this one on this side, which we finished out the other week. As you can see, I have a weld across here and a weld across the whole top here, and it's virtually invisible. We're gonna do the same today, and it's not as complicated as you may think. So there are three major parts of this quarter panel, four if you count the duct in the back. We're not gonna worry about that today. We have the front, the rear, and this upper sill. Now, they are roughed in custom made panels that we made to fit the design we wanted and also fit the new wheels that we're fitting on the car. We're putting 12-inch wide rear wheels in the back. So step one is we're going to fit this new custom wheel to this quarter panel. Step two, we're going to scribe and cut these custom quarter panel panels that we made. Custom quarter panel panels, that's a mouthful. And then step three, we're going to go ahead and we're going to weld these seams. And we're gonna have nice butt welds, which means these welds are going to be butted together and not overlap. That's extremely important, and we'll go over that later. And then finally, step four, we're going to go ahead and planish out these welds and make them completely invisible through some metal finishing. Whew, that's gonna be a big video, so stick around, this is gonna be a good one. So before we do anything, I need to make sure this flange will not scrub against the wheel because I oversized the flange, but that's okay, we can cut it. Look at that, like the paint is coming right off. The rust is under the paint. The car's been repainted before, so I don't know what bodywork's been done to it, but that's not supposed to happen on a paint job. You're ruining a perfectly good 928, Ryan! This is a great candidate for this. Let's wait till you see the interior. Basically, it's gotta come in a little bit. It's gotta flare out a little bit. But otherwise, we're pretty good. I mean, this is quarter panel lip to wheel lip there. So there are two major welds we need to do in this project. We have a shorter one that's vertical here, that's dead center of the panel, which as many of you know, welding in the center of the panel is pretty dangerous for warp. And then we have the second long run that goes the whole way from here to the front here. That's going to be a very, very challenging weld as well. We're gonna start off with this first weld, and in this first weld, I'm going to be using extremely basic tooling, hammers and dollies and such. Here, the second weld is gonna be a little more complicated. I'm gonna show a little bit different tooling for that. First off, I probably should explain what I'm using here are called Clecos. Very basic explanation is that they are reusable rivets. If I squeeze them with the tool here, they compress and they can fit through an 1/8-inch hole, and when I release, they expand again and it can grab two lapped panels and smush them together. So I have these two panels lapped currently. If I remove these Clecos and put them back on the exact same spots, it'll be in the exact same orientation every single time and all planes of movement here, as long as I have them put in the right spot. This is Dychem Blue Steel Layout Fluid. Highly recommend for scribing. A scribe is much better to use than like a Sharpie or Inksol when butting panels together, because this line is much more prominent, as you can see, and skinnier than if I were to use a marker, because a marker, look how much thicker that is. Where do I cut? On the left side of the line, right side of the line, dead center of the line? Should I leave this solvent-soaked rag right here while I weld?
Yeah, perfect.
Maybe I can just prop it up with this can, so like while I'm welding, I push down hard, it'll spray. a little prank for your buddies.
Gotcha, you got 3rd-degree burn.
You're good at these skid grafts. All right, so one of the most important things that you need to do when welding two large sheet panels together, or even in general, sheet metal in general, welding it together with butt weld, is make sure they're on the exact same plane. As you can see right here, I have a straight edge across, and it's close. I'm gonna have to use my vice grip as I go along and make sure it's perfectly level, but I'm gonna get as close as possible throughout the whole panel. And now as up here you can see the gap. I need to make sure this gap is not there when I get to that point. That's going to ensure that you get the least amount of warp possible, because if they're misaligned any which way, as the tack that you make heats up, it's going to expand and then contract again over and over again for each tack, which is going to cause it to buckle either which way. So I'm going to start by pushing these panels together and then tacking every roughly ½ inch across the whole panel to lock it in. So you'll find as you go and tack through your panel that the tacks, as they cool, they shrink, right? So they're pulling the panel closer. So you'll find further down the line here that your panel will want to actually overlap and buckle. To avoid that, what we're going to do is go through and hammer and dolly each tack to kind of relax them a little bit and bring them back to where they were before they were tacked. I actually do not advise force cooling anything when you're welding. If you're welding a panel and you force cool it with your blowgun, you're actually going to shrink it and maybe even potentially harden it more than if you let it cool ambiently. You're gonna actually have less warpage that way. So what we're going to do is I'm gonna take my little dolly here, I'm gonna slide it behind the panel, I'm gonna hammer directly on each of these tacks a little bit to kind of relax them a little bit, and then this will actually line up so I can actually weld it as I want to. So now I've gone through with a hammer and dolly and hammered down specifically on these welds, right? These tack welds I use to lock in this panel. That's relaxed and it's reset again, and then you can just blast through in one solid TIG weld. Now, I know that when I say one solid TIG weld, many of you are cringing, but I assure you that it is the best way to tackle any kind of exterior body panel work like this. And I'm going to explain why after I weld it. Another very important step is to go through and grind the tops of your tacks so you have the least amount of material there before you weld the overall bead. What's important is the more material there to heat up is the more movement you're going to have as it expands and contracts with the heating and cooling, especially if you're using a thicker filler rod. I'm using the thinnest filler rod we have here for this, but even thinner is better. And if you don't have very thin filler rod, you can walk over to your MIG welder and pull out a length of the spool wire and use that wire itself to weld if you have to. Because again, the least amount of material you can use, the better. I just ran a solid TIG welding bead from one end to the other end without stopping, which may blow the minds of some of you watching this. Now, what you notice is this blue haze, which is actually the heat affected zone, the HAZ. Now, you'll see from front to the end, it is approximately the same width the whole way through. It's a little cooler up here. That's where I started, that's why it's a little cooler, but it is completely consistent from front to back. Not only that, I ran 37 amps, this is 19 gauge steel. You'll notice that I have perfect penetration the whole way through as well, which is incredibly important, because if the penetration is inconsistent, then guess what? Your panel warpage and movement is also going to be inconsistent. The reason I keep using the word consistent is because consistency is key when it comes to welding sheet metal, especially with exterior body panels. If you have inconsistent welding throughout this panel, whether you're jumping around, you're force cooling it, it's going to cause it to buckle. Every individual spot that you are tacking and heating and cooling is going to expand and contract differently. And then when you massage out any kind of distortion from your weld, it's going to be a nightmare because you're not gonna know exactly how you should treat every square inch. Now, you could do this process with like an oxyacetylene torch and you can gas weld it. If you were going above and beyond in gas welding too, you could fusion weld this and use no filler rod whatsoever, which I also could have done as well with this if my gap was a little bit tighter. I prefer to add a little bit of material, which will cause it to shrink a little bit more, but then I have a little bit more room to grind away in case of undercut. If you do go the route of using a MIG welder, I did that for a long time before I had a TIG welder, I would recommend do not force cool the tacks because it's going to become more brittle and harder to work if you force cool that weld. You can see if I take a straight edge here and I lay it across this ruler, you can see it's nice and level now. And it only took a couple seconds of beating it with a hammer. So we've got our weld hand planished out now. Now planishing is when you take a hammer and dolly or any other tool like a planishing hammer, even the English wheel or like a power hammer, and you smash the weld into itself and get it to a nice level, distortion-free state. So that's what planishing is, the non-Webster Dictionary version. I could Google it for you, but you can do that too. Let's go see if it still fits the car. So, we're in the part of the fit up now. I've already put the layout fluid down. It's clecoed down, but I have a nice, mostly tight gap. There's a little floater here, that's okay, I can work with that. But there's one big thing that's gonna be a little bit different this time. I'm going to go ahead and mark where these clecos are and leave little tongues that stick out up above panels here.
I like how there's a drip for each, like,
Each
tab.
tongue, yeah. It's just salivating at the idea of being part of the 928 wide body experience. Aren't we all, tongues? Aren't we all? These tongues will allow the rest of the panel to get parallel to each other, whereas the tongues themselves will keep them spaced and kind of lapped. The goal here is to go through, push from the back here, get these panels level, tack them, and then I'll be able to take a Sawzall blade and cut off these tongues, and then they won't be lapped anymore. So what all these tongues are doing is they're serving as a locator for the panel, because if it, you know, shimmies a couple millimeters either which way, it's not gonna fit anymore. So this is a planishing hammer, and it's not an expensive one. This is an Eastwood planishing hammer. Now we do have custom dies for ours and a custom post, but basically all it is an air hammer mounted on a frame that you can then modulate with your foot and adjust the pressure up top and then slide your panel inside there, and it works like a hammer dolly would work without having to reach around a panel and go like this. It kind of saves your arm, and it deafens yourself and your neighbors and everyone else you love and hate. And otherwise, it's a great machine. So now, the planishing hammer did do its job. I just zipped over it quickly. I didn't want to overstretch anything. Now I have a little bit of a gap. It's relatively consistent. It's consistent enough. Now I'm ready to weld from end to end. And I will say too, that from like approximately here back is not correct on the top of this panel. I'm not too worried about that because this is gonna end up getting cut off and then merged into the panel I make for the up back here. So don't mind that. All right, so check that out. This is what proper preparation does for you. It did not deform most any at all. There's a little bit of deformation, there's a little bit of warp, but it is not very warped at all. In fact, if I had gone ahead and welded this before I planished out those tacks, this thing would have been all over the place. But because it was locked down to a single plane, it stayed within that plane when it shrunk. Kinda wanna shoot Peppa.
The way it like buckled was so funny.
So this is the English wheel. There's arguments whether or not this is called the English wheel or the wheeling machine. Well, it says English wheel right here on the label, so. The way this machine works is there's an upper anvil and a lower anvil. The lower anvils almost always have different radiuses that you can use a radii to push shape into a panel. The upper anvil typically is flat. So what I have to do here is I take my panel, I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the machine, lock it down, and right now I have just enough pressure that I can barely slide it side to side. I'm gonna go slightly tighter than that with this lower wheel here, and then I'm going to wheel it back and forth as uniformly as possible without forcing it to buckle up and down or any which way. And what it'll do is it'll actually stretch the material, depending on how much pressure it have, but also kind of just wash the material into a uniform state that's not so lumpy. It's a relatively classical tool that's been used for coach building for hundreds of years. Now I know you're thinking, this is not a simple or cheap tool to have in your shop, and you're correct. Over here we have a Harbor Freight English wheel, which they do still sell. And as you can also see, it's been modified, not too extensively, but it's been braced because the upper anvil will walk side to side. But you can still get a decent amount of stretch out of these wheels. It's like I think it's like a $300 wheel or something like that. And then, you know, throw some steel on it and polish up the anvils because they're kind of crappy out of the box. And you have a decent English wheel to learn how to wheel with. It's not like the English wheel or the Planishing hammer are excessively expensive, but there are expensive options out there for them. If you want to know more about the English wheel, I'd be open to doing a video. So let me know in the comments down below if that's what you want to see, or if you have any other specific things in the shop using any tooling we have or projects wise that you'd like to see in the comments below. So one of the biggest things I can still stress consistently throughout this video is that consistency is key when you're trying to do a warp-free weld. Now, the welding here may not have been 100% warp-free, but we were able to get the warps out pretty easily. I say easily like it took no time, but obviously it took time, it took effort, it took practice. If you can keep your heat localized and in one solid bead moving across rather than jumping around, you're gonna have a lot less panel distortion. I know that goes against what many people have taught, and many of you are probably headed to the comments right now to say I'm wrong, but you can't argue with the results, can you? So for now, I'm calling this quarter panel done. There is still a lot left to do on this project, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. We'll catch you next week. Later.